that Jeff Lang shared with me. His dad fought in the Philippines. This is his father, Jeff's father. Jeff, what was your father's first name?
Eddie.
Eddie. And he fought in the Philippines. Helped liberate it, to be more precise. And he worked on the aircraft, right?
No, he was at the base after it got bombed, and she got that.
And that's how he came in connection with this woman, Amelia Earhart. Wow. Why did this cut out again?
It's because of systems.
Okay, Amelia Earhart. And if I get this wrong, tell me. But the aircraft, was he there before they took off on her last flight?
He got that from a native who helped unload the plane because she and Fred Noonan wanted to lighten up the plane flying over the Pacific.
Right.
She's not going to do any good. So they lightened up the load that came off the plane before she left.
Peace. Jeff has a piece. His father had Amelia Earhart's last aircraft. Wow. We have a very interesting group, don't we? I'll get this back to you sometime.
Just put it with that frame thing you're keeping.
Along with the Lincoln assassination.
I apologize. This system keeps going in and on and off, so like
I'll just have to talk loud, in a loud voice, I guess. If it comes on, let me know, Pat. Okay, we left us at Hospital 1. They also located and built, they being nurses, doctors, Filipino support, civilians. They built Hospital 2. Clever name for each. A green mountainous area in the jungle where military engineers could carve out a camp. It had the attraction of running water. Again, very primitive, 3 large wooden buildings that could be converted into staff quarters, wards, and operating rooms. And as they got ready, as the nurses and doctors got their patients ready to move them, I guess I could move on. They had packed and were boarded, leaving Hospital 1 on January 25th of 1942. They took with, think of this, in their 29-day stay in December, January of 41, 42, at this jungle hospital, Hospital 1, they had treated 1,200 casualties. Now they took the patients who were still there, they took them with them, they moved further into the jungle, into yet a more primitive hospital. And a few hours, less than a day, after they left Hospital 1, direct hit from a Japanese bomber, and Hospital 1 was burned to the ground. Hospital 2, by the way, I went back to this picture with Josie Nesbitt and Maud Davison because they're standing outside of what became Hospital 2. They didn't have roofs. It was an open air. The whole facility was open air. Again, they're in the jungle. They found somewhere old iron beds, rickety wooden cots. Somehow they managed to cobble together 7 wards and a dispensary, and they treated each day at Hospital 2 in the jungle, again, open air, between 200 and 500 patients, most of them American soldiers. Where do they put them, by the way? When the American soldiers, Filipino soldiers came in, they put them on the jungle floor, usually on a sheet. They had a hospital sheet, and under a canopy of branches and vines. Hospital 2, by the way, is probably the first, a lot of firsts here, the first Army hospital of such size located near installations that are being constantly bombed. As one doctor in the group remarked, it probably was the first time someone had decided to evacuate patients toward the front instead of away from the front. Josie Nesbitt, on your left, was chosen she's a first lieutenant. She's chosen to lead Hospital 2. And again, she's second in command to Maud Davison in the middle. Josie was a no-nonsense officer. She actually had a maternal side that she didn't show too often, but if one of her nurses needed to have a private discussion, she was there for them. Same with the Filipino nurses who came to call her Mama Josie. This woman, by the way, at this time, 1942, is 47 years old. She'd been raised on farms in Missouri and Kansas. She'd had a hard life. She was an orphan by the age of 12. And by the time of 1942, Hospital 2 in Bataan, Josie Nesbitt has been a registered nurse for more than 30 years. And how did she get into the Army, become an Army nurse? She volunteered in 1918 because a pandemic, influenza, was ravaging the military.
Where did she serve in World War I?
Pardon me?
Where did she serve in World War I?
Where did she serve in World War I? Bill, I don't know.
Okay. My grandmother was an Army nurse in World War I too.
Really? I have a book. We could look it up.
All right.
We could look it up. If she had any doubts, and how she did not have doubts, taking charge of Hospital 2, Josie Nesbitt kept it to herself. Later, after the war, she would say, "Admittedly, I tired more quickly, and much of the stamina I had in the past may have been somewhat lacking when we withdrew to the combat zone on Bataan. But there was absolutely no time for self-pity." In reality, everyone who knew her said she always would work herself to exhaustion. She also had a sense of humor, which would pop up from time to time. One time, during 42, Hospital 2, and she would talk about this later, she said, "We were the first nurses in the United States Army to be subjected to actual combat. On Bataan, there simply were no rare areas. Although we worked around the clock, we were careful to ensure that when troops saw a woman nurse, that nurse had to look as much like a woman as circumstances would permit. In light of our situation, that was not easily accomplished." And again, they're a long way from the white starched uniforms. In reality, everyone, Hospital 2, and they actually rebuilt Hospital 1, in the jungle, doctors, nurses, orderlies, everyone, they often work day and night. They worked in blackout conditions at night. By the way, they used flashlights or kerosene lamps painted blue to perform surgery at night. And they did it all while listening to the sounds of war. Bombs falling, the artillery and anti-aircraft guns firing, and of course the cries of the wounded. By March of 42, it was very clear that one of the major threats at the Jungle Hospital was malaria. By March of 42 at Hospital 2 on Bataan, they were averaging about 500 cases of malaria a day. By April the 1st, 42, they were averaging 1,000 cases a day of malaria. And quinine, which was the only drug available to be of any help, was in acutely short supply. Obviously, if you're working with patients, if you're caring for them, dressing them, bathing them, sewing up their wounds, performing surgery, you're not going to be immune to all this. One commander at Hospital 2 estimated that by the time they left, at least half of his nurses also had malaria. By the way, as time wore on, there were other problems, certainly, dysentery, as you might expect, and also malnutrition. There were also, before I leave the discussion of the Jungle Hospital, there were also other concerns. Dr. John Bumgarner was at Hospital 2, worked with the nurses every day. After the war, he wrote, "One of the most remarkable things coming out of our experience on Bataan was the presence and performance of the Army nurses. In my mind, however, and the minds of others, there lurked the fear that we would be unable to protect the nurses should the Japanese combat troops overrun the hospital. We had all heard the stories out of China about the atrocities committed against women and the female population at Nanking. You remember the rape of Nanking. It was a real concern at Hospital 2 and Hospital 1. Another thing that's interesting, I'm going to share with you, was unlike the Japanese, the American doctors and nurses also treated Japanese soldiers. When a captured Japanese who was wounded was brought in, Hippocratic oath, they would treat them. They also noticed how remarkably robust the enemy looked. The typical Japanese soldier had individual water filters. Think of how foul the water was. They had medical kits on them, and they seemed to always have ample supplies of food. Didn't go unnoticed. Frank Hewitt was a UPI, United Press International reporter, covering the Bataan campaign. And around this time, he summed up the mood of the troops, the doctors, the nurses. He wrote this bit of doggerel. He wrote, and this got widely circulated, "We're the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no nephews, no nieces. No rifles, no guns, no artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn." Showing solidarity and also a little bit of a sense of humor as this ditty circulated around, the nurses began referring to themselves as the battling bells of Bataan. A word about the press coverage. Word of the nurses on Manila, Bataan, Corregidor began to get surface in the American press. This is at a time when women in combat, as we've discussed, was a novelty. There was one physical therapist at Hospital 2, an Army nurse who managed to get a letter through God knows how, undoubtedly through maybe a convoy, a letter to her mother. And as any letter you would write, if you're in this situation on Bataan to your mother, she lied. And she told her she was fine, conditions weren't that bad, a little dirty, long hours, but she was just okay. That letter found its way into the New York Times in 1942. And the headline on the article is, "Nurse on Corregidor finds it not too bad." Letter says, "Hairpin shortage causes women to cut their hair." Again, you cannot make that up. The role of women still was not quite understood, could not be for a long time. On February the 16th, 42, one of the Hospital 2 nurses, Ruth Straub, she kept a diary, amazingly, throughout the Philippine campaign. And in her diary on February 15th, 16th, she wrote, "Another busy day. Don't feel badly until 1 p.m. when it gets hot. 8 of us jumped into a small foxhole in a raid today and nearly killed each other. One of the cooks was shot through the head. Rats are chewing up our clothes, iguanas every night, food progressively worse, more malaria. All in all, we are all pretty low. And we nurses look very strange in our Air Corps dungarees. Mine is size 42.
Question.
Yes.
What was the lady on the right, the nurse on the right, what was her name?
I know it, but I didn't write it down. She was one of the nurses on the staff at headquarters. This would be headquarters, hospital number 2. I could get her name for you, but she was on the staff. This is artillery, as you can see on the Bataan Peninsula. This is interesting. Newsweek, March 9th, 1942. Newsweek at that time was poor, second cousin in circulation to Time magazine, and certainly to Life magazine, but it was coming on. It viewed itself, it was published in New York and it published nationwide. It kind of viewed itself as a weekly. There was a little to the political left, probably, of Time magazine at the time, but certainly a mainstream American newspaper. And here we have March 1942, MacArthur of Bataan, the war's #1 hero. MacArthur would have agreed with that, by the way. At this time, March of 42, in reality, the defenders on Bataan were cut off from all communication with headquarters in Australia. Then MacArthur received a message from President Roosevelt, and we have it in this cable, this radiogram actually. MacArthur is flatly told for the first time by FDR that there will be no reinforcements. They simply don't have them. He also ordered MacArthur to evacuate his family to Australia. So, now, to be fair to Douglas MacArthur, 4-star general, to be fair, he was ordered. We know he put up some resistance. People debate how much. But at the end of the day, his commander said, "You're leaving Corregidor. You're setting up headquarters for the command in Australia. And in the end, if you're ordered, you go." On March the 11th, 1942, therefore, Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines. He left General Wainwright, his number 2, who I showed you early on, in command. And on March 17th, after a harrowing journey on a small PT boat to Mindanao, and then on in a tiny plywood PT boat to a spot where they could take a flight to Australia on a B-17. On March 17th, MacArthur gets to what becomes his Pacific headquarters. And when he arrives, he immediately makes a radio broadcast. It was picked up everywhere. And by the way, there was a hidden radio, shortwave radio at Hospital 1, so they could have heard this. And this is where he says, "I came through and I shall return." One of the most famous lines of the Second World War. I shall return. For the most part, the doctors and nurses, patients, soldiers on Bataan and Corregidor, by most accounts, their reaction to MacArthur being ordered to Australia, well, they felt betrayed. Fair or not, they felt betrayed. Assistant Chief Nurse Ann Mealor, Mealor, would say later, "We were just about as down as we could be when MacArthur left." And one soldier, whose name is lost to history, but who was at Bataan, wrote, and again, people like, I guess when you're in wartime, you write doggerel, you write little ditties, little poems. And he wrote a little ditty about the situation called Dugout Doug, which of course instantly every doctor and nurse and soldier patient had a copy of this. And it went like this: "Dugout Doug's not timid, he's just cautious, not afraid. He's carefully protecting the stars that Franklin made. 4-star generals are as rare as good food on Bataan, and his troops keep starving on." So again, there was some bitterness. Skinny Wainwright, Jonathan Skinny Wainwright, assumed command of now 60,000 American and Filipino troops on Bataan. And Wainwright, by the way, was by all accounts very well liked by those who served under him. He, before he left Bataan for Corregidor, the main command post, in fact, Wainwright visited the field hospitals, including Hospital 2, the most prominent one, to try to raise the spirits and morale of doctors, nurses, and patients. You can see here April the 9th, 1942. By the way, General Marshall and Harry Hopkins are in London dealing with the European War. You also see Japanese forces pound new line on Japan. Again, April the 9th, 1942. Defenders retire, forced back under hail of blows by enemy, reckless of losses. Thwart a beach landing. Guns of bay forts pour shells into barge concentration, 4th day of attack. So more and more the news of the dire situation on Bataan and Corregidor was seeping through. Wainwright would hold out for another month until April the 10th, 1942, when he evacuated all remaining American Filipino forces from Bataan. They left Bataan, which was, and he transferred some 3,000 troops to Corregidor for what could only be seen as a last stand. He left General King in charge of American ground troops on Bataan, the few that were left. And that leads to another cartoon. I think that MacArthur's way of telling us, he's keeping his promise to return to the Philippines. Wainwright says as he looks at Manila being bombed, and he's on Corregidor, and he's saying, they look something like Indian smoke signals, General. The Japanese, however, now held all strategic coastal positions in the central Philippines, and this is Bataan in April of 1940. You can see it had been reduced to near rubble. And from there, now that we had withdrawn from Bataan, there'd be ceaseless bombing of the Rock on Corregidor, the Rock Corregidor. Almost immediately, or at the same time that he gave the order to abandon, for the most part, Bataan and leave only a token force there, General Wainwright also ordered the immediate evacuation of all medical personnel to Corregidor. The reaction of the nurses, by the way, is interesting. When they got the orders that they were leaving Hospital 2 and the rebuilt Hospital 1 and were going to those 2 miles to the fortress of Corregidor, for the most part they were appalled. They were angry. We can see in their letters, or their diaries, and what they would say after the war, almost to a nurse they were angry, and many even considered disobeying orders. The question they kept asking was, what about our patients on Bataan? We're just going to leave them? Cassiani, an Army nurse from Bridgewater, Massachusetts, would say, we knew what we had to do, take care of these guys, and we were willing to do anything we had to do it. Nonetheless, you're in the Army now, you're in the Navy, they're superiors, that you will follow orders, and indeed what did happen was they did evacuate to Bataan, although the trip across was very rough, and the patients were left abandoned. Bataan.
They were left?
Pardon me?
They were left?
They were left. They were left. You can see why nurses were appalled, doctors as well, but they were left. There was no way to take them. The nurses and doctors got out on very small little vessels. Some of them almost sunk on the way to Corregidor, and there were no facilities, no boats to take the patients. And of course, all the while, they were also being shelled and bombed. Edith Shacklet. Edith Shacklet was called Shack by all of her fellow nurses. She's at the reconstructed Hospital 1. By the way, Shacklet's from Brandenburg, Kentucky. She is summoned on Bataan to Colonel Duckworth's office, and she would later write, the word is that Bataan will surrender tomorrow. We're going to get the nurses out over to Corregidor. We don't want any women around when the Jap soldiers come in, he told us. You go tell everybody to stop what they're doing and take what possessions they can. A bus will be down here in about 30 minutes. So that's how abrupt it was. Nurse Shacklet protested, made the case we can't abandon our patients, but to no avail. It's estimated, by the way, and this is Hospital 1 where Shack was, it's estimated that they had to leave behind about almost 2,000 defenseless patients.
What did the Japanese do to the patients?
That's right.
For the most part, yes. In Hospital 2, again, also in the jungle, they just said, get out of here. You know, if you can walk out. If you can crawl, you can crawl out. If you can't do either, too bad. And we'll never know the exact numbers, but we don't think very many patients survived. War is hell. Bataan Falls, estimated 36,800 entrapped. Herald American, this is the New York Herald American, I believe. At Hospital 2.
It's Chicago.
Chicago, thank you. Yeah, it is, thank you. That keeps me on. Oh, Bataan Battle, Chicago Heroes. I guess they wouldn't have that in the New York newspaper. You're so clever. And by the way, the man there is General Wainwright, who had to announce the surrender. At Hospital 2, Josie Nesbitt, whom you saw, who was in charge at Hospital 2, received similar orders from Colonel Gillespie, again, a male superior commander. He said, tell your nurses to get down here to my office by 2000 hours and take only what they can carry in their hands. Again, she protested on behalf of the patients. Again, she lost. Somehow she did get 88 nurses across the Manila Bay to Corregidor, although they had several near misses from courtesy of Japanese dive bombers. No, this is the Brooklyn Eagle. Brooklyn, by the way, is in New York City. Fate of exhausted troops in doubt. Manila Bay forts hold out. Again, I'm always fascinated by how what also winds up on the front page, earth-shattering. Right, Americans were following Bataan very closely, as well as the Philippines campaign. And at the same time, story about the racetrack, Jamaica track, open today. The mayor, Valentine, sick jurist to try 32 cops in Brooklyn on charges of graft, and other sordid stories, as well as the story about the tank battle on the Eastern Front between the Soviets and the Germans. But the story was clear to all Americans. Newsstand, Bataan collapses. And again, that number, which isn't quite accurate, but the 36,800 number of those trapped appears over and over again in newspapers. Ultimately, when Bataan surrendered, 78,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered. General Wainwright was brought to the offices of the Japanese commander and surrendered, again, 78,000, the largest surrender in anyone's memory. Mostly American, some Filipino troops. Yes?
Jim, where does the Bataan Death March fit into this?
You know, we didn't rehearse this. That's what I'm going to talk about next.
You've got 10 minutes.
Yeah. We have about 8 minutes, don't we?
Yeah.
By the way, I will get to that. We still have time. But I just want to show you. Notice anything unusual about this Manila newspaper? Bataan completely occupied by Japanese forces. General Homa, the Japanese commander, takes all officer and men under him thanks them for their heroism. Surrender of Bataan praised. Clearly the Japanese are in control of Manila. And so the news coverage is anti-American, anti-Filipino resistance. And at the bottom is General Wainwright surrendering to his Japanese counterpart. By the way, with the surrender baton, and I guess there's another photograph. These are again Americans. I mentioned the 78,000. These are Americans surrender, and some Filipinos surrendering to the Japanese. With the surrender of Bataan, April the 9th, 1942, one of the nurses would write in her diary, an eerie silence descended over the Bataan Peninsula. To some across the bay, on Corregidor, the quiet seemed more unsettling than the estimated 907 tons of explosives that the enemy had dropped on them during the siege of Bataan and Corregidor. 907 tons of explosives. Suddenly it stopped. The Japanese stripped their prisoners of their canteens, food, rings, wristwatches, any personal papers or letters, and essentially anything they wanted. And then they began, right on cue, then they began the Bataan, what became known as the Bataan Death March. Somewhere along, the idea was they were going to be walked very long distance to a prison camp up north. Somewhere along, early along the death march, the American soldiers, and they were mostly American soldiers on the death march, an evil reality set in. And that was the Japanese, their Japanese captives did not care at all if they lived or died or made it to their destination. Here you see American soldiers on the march carrying wounded soldiers on those stretchers. The Japanese guards with them would shoot anyone who dropped behind, stumbled, or fainted. If an American officer protested the treatment of his men, they were usually lashed to trees and either eviscerated or beheaded. Many countless other men were beaten with rifle butts, shovels, bamboo canes, clubs, fists. If a soldier on the march tried to rest or take a drink, they saw water nearby, they were immediately bludgeoned unconscious, usually murdered. And as they walked along, mile after bloody mile, the ditches along Japan's main road soon became filled with, forgive me, headless and emaciated corpses. I'm not going to show that to you, but these are some of the men along the, I guess when they're about to begin the death march. The exact figures we'll never know. Likely, we think about 72,000 men, almost all Americans, started the march. And at the end, when they arrived at the prison camps, there were about 54,000. So we lost around 18,000 people, men, along the road. And that wasn't the end of it. In their first 60 days of captivity, once they got to the prison camps, the 54,000 who got there, thousands more would die in prison. What was the final toll? Now, of the 78,000 I mentioned who started the Bataan Death March, less than half ever saw home again. Less than half. Certainly a new metaphor. Bataan Death March became a new metaphor for brutality, unspeakable brutality. I'm going to show you one more thing before we could be forced to stop. Back to Corregidor. By the way, Corregidor, as you saw, is sort of a tadpole island fortress. It's 3.5 miles long. It's 1.5 miles wide. You had two basic groups. You had the soldiers who manned the big guns, and the Marines who stood vigil along the beach defenses. They lived in dugouts and shacks or bunkers. Everybody else on Corregidor now, which was about 10,000 people, including our nurses, were holed up in a complex of well-designed concrete tunnels that were deep underneath the hard rock of Malinta Hill, known as the Malinta Tunnel. And this is a admittedly not great photograph, but again, photography when you're in a underground hospital in wartime isn't crystal clear. But you can see some nurses, and I believe either a doctor or orderly in the Malinta Tunnel, which had been built, by the way, years and years and years before. But it's underground concrete tunnels, which they converted into a hospital. The chief at the Malinta Tunnel Hospital, we saw her before, was Josie Nesbitt's boss, Maud Davison. In fact, both Maud Davison and Josie Nesbitt are now in command at the tunnel of some 85 Army nurses, 1 Navy nurse, and 26 Filipino nurses, as well as dozens of civilians. Miss Davison, I'm going to stop in a moment. Miss Davison, as everyone called her, was not warm and fuzzy. She was in charge. And she was 57 years old, a strict disciplinarian, and she'd been in the Army Nurse Corps for 24 years by 1942. And conditions were bad when their bombing started in Manila. They got much worse in the jungle hospitals on Bataan. Now, the nurses and doctors and patients would discover conditions could be even more brutal at the Malinta Tunnel. As nurse Ruth Straub of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, wrote in her diary on April 28th, every patient in the hospital has been given a gas mask. Now, this is, I'm afraid, where I'm going to have to stop. I think our time is up. I'm getting a note from oh, thank you. The photograph, the third woman is Anna Williams, Army nurse, along with Josie Nesbitt and Maud Davison. That picture outside of Hospital 2. So we do have it.
Someone back there said, looks like a movie star.
Yeah, she does. She does. In fact, that will become a point of controversy next time.
Any questions? Any questions?
Yeah. Any questions before we? By the way, as usual, I thought I'd get to the end.
Yeah.
And you see what happened to the nurses at the end of by the end of the war in the Philippines. We're not quite there. We have to first go through the next phase, which will be when they're sent to a prison camp.
How long was the Bataan Death March mileage?
You know, next time, I have a map. And I said, I'm going to include that map because Bill asked me about it. And I forgot to do it. So, but I'll tell you next time and show you the route. Yes.
I just have a statement, y'all. Jim did not go to a Unit 21 party last night because he was doing homework, and he did this wonderful speech today. So let's.
Thank you very much. Your check will be in the mail. If you did enjoy it, and I know some of this is very grim, but again, I'll go back to where we started. The role of women, isn't their role fascinating in the Philippines campaign? I think these Army, Navy nurses, what they did, what they went through, what they're going to go through, I think it's a story that needs to be told. And if you didn't like it, Judy sent me the email.
Judy Rowe, R-O-W-E.
R-O-W-E. Saying we need to focus on the ladies, the women. I also, actually I promised the day, I think it was the day before I got the email, I'd ordered, but you won't believe it, I ordered a book that I read, and I highly recommend. It's We Band of Angels. The American press, which we'll get to next time, as the nurses became more and more, their story became known to some extent, kind of a sanitized version of what they were going through in the Philippines. As it became better known during the war, the press began calling them the Angels of Bataan. So this book is We Band of Angels, the untold story of American nurses, and it is an untold story until now, trapped on Bataan by the Japanese. This book came out about 20 years ago, I believe, 1999. And it was written by Elizabeth Norman, who herself was a military nurse who then became a military historian and has written 3 well-regarded books. This is the first one. She also wrote a book about nurses, Army nurses in Vietnam. And she also wrote a book, her 3rd book is on the Bataan Death March. So I haven't read the other 2, but I highly recommend this one. Yes?
The Bataan Death March was between 60 and 69.6 miles.
There you go.
6 days.
Since the day of electronic devices.
You want to say that again so people hear?
Oh, I'm sorry. The Bataan Death March, Jeff informs me, was between 60 and
69.5 miles.
69.5 miles.
According to Bing.
Well, again, that's one of the great things. When you're at a university, you live in fear of those devices. Well, you know, you said, and by the way, I'm keeping Amelia Earhart here. All right.
See you next.
Anybody else before we wrap up for the day? And we will see you next month.